Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Cape Fear is a psychological thriller film adaptation of the novel The Executioners by John D. MacDonald. Alfred Hitchcock adapted it for film in 1962, and Martin Scorsese remade that adaptation in 1991. In one of the closing scenes of the story, the star of the movie, a public legal defender, and a villain, a violent rapist whom he put away in prison, they're both on a yacht in the middle of a violent thunderstorm, engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, beating each other with rocks. That scene ends with the rapist handcuffed to the ship as it hits ground and begins to break up and sink. As I watched that movie, that final fight scene was etched in my memory because, as that rapist, played by Robert De Niro, as he goes down with the ship and eventually drowns, he's speaking in tongues. Now, I've got to say that particular scene was a bit unnerving for me because I saw that only a couple years after I'd finally left the Pentecostal church, after finally just not being able to deal with the strange things that were entirely normal in that church. So, now, why am I talking about this? Just a few weeks ago, I happened to run into an old friend who was a big part of that evangelical Pentecostal era in my life. He's now in the theater arts, and I happened to go to one of his shows. After the show, we got caught up on what happened since our paths diverged, and then we continued that conversation online. And in that conversation, he mentioned how he had just done a monologue about how speaking in tongues led to him being an artist, and that he'd since given a number of workshops for theater artists on how to speak in tongues. And I had to say to him that I was surprised that there was a demand for that kind of skill in the performing arts. I can't say that I'd seen many theatrical performances apart from that Scorsese movie in which speaking in tongues was an important ingredient. Now, Scott, have you ever encountered this thing called speaking in tongues, either in churches or in movies?
Yeah, I have. For a short period of time in my early days as a new convert, got involved with a kind of a charismatic group. And I had an interesting experience, actually, because speaking in tongues was a very important part of their worship and their culture. And they didn't necessarily say it explicitly, but there was a strong feeling that, if you were kind of a subclass Christian, if you didn't experience that. So I met with the pastor, and he said, well, everybody can speak in tongues. And so we talked and we prayed and stuff like that, and nothing was happening. And he said, why don't you just start babbling a bit? And so I did. And then he would do some and so on and so forth. So by the time, to be honest, I kind of did it more or less to shut him up.
Put him off your back.
Yeah, it was pretty much, I faked it, and so he believed, I guess, that I had spoken in tongues, but I left, very, very unsatisfied and very, kind of frustrated by the whole experience. And that probably was part of the reason why I parted ways with that movement fairly early on. So it wasn't a huge part of my life or experience, but I did have that one encounter.
That's an interesting story.
Yeah.
So this friend and I talked a bit more about this strange part of our evangelical past, and that in turn started me into a deep dive, researching the history and even the science behind this phenomenon. And I was actually really quite surprised at how much I found. You see, speaking in tongues was another example of weird things that we charismatics did back in those days, and of course they still do. But for me, this is one of those things that I just shuffled away into a dark, closed closet, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. That whole tongues thing in church was strange. It was weird, and I just didn't want to confront it, didn't want to really admit to it. But it was part of my evangelical history, and now I was beginning to see it from a whole new perspective. And I was surprised by what I found out about the phenomenon and about myself. And then I wondered if other evangelicals, the ones who listen to this podcast, recovering evangelicals, people trying to make sense of their evangelical roots, I wondered if they might be interested in this topic, if it might benefit them in some way. So I put this to our private discussion group. Did they think that this topic would make a great episode? And I was surprised actually at how quickly people responded that it would be. Within just a couple of days, I had more than I ever would have expected responding, all of them giving me the thumbs up. So I asked my friend from the theater arts if he was up for it, and Here he is. Gary Kirkham, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here, Luke.
I'm so glad you took up the invitation, and it was quite a shock when you and I talked about this. And it'll be interesting to get your perspective on this. But maybe for starters, we'll just give the audience an introduction to who Gary Kirkham is. This kid who grew up to be an actor and producer and writer, and then maybe also get a little bit, if you're comfortable, into your charismatic Christian tradition, where you came from and where you're at now on that.
Yeah, I guess I should start at the early days with maybe I was 12 years old. My father got saved. And there was this transformation that often happens in that world. And our family was a real kind of seeking family. Like we were in Christian Science in the before that, and
Oh, really?
spiritualism. Yeah, spiritualism.
I
And
didn't know that.
oh yeah. We were all over the place. We were always like searching and searching. So my father would read all these books about stuff and psychics and everything, and he just felt that there was something else out there. And so Christianity was the one, and we were kind of used to my dad being kind of this outrageous character, to say the least. I mean, he was born to be that kind of person. Anyways, he found charismatic evangelical, and he went to one of the Pentecostal church in Hamilton. And that transformation was pretty stark. He changed kind of everything, dropped smoking right away. Like he was a hardcore smoker and stopped smoking after they prayed with him, like done. And on hindsight, it seemed like something quite miraculous. And so, anyways, we went to the church, and quickly we saw that community of people that was like, I think Pentecostals and Evangelicals all want to have new people coming. And if you're like unsaved, they're even happier to have you there, new meat. And so the response and the friendships that happened quite away. We got invited for dinner for people. And all of a sudden there was this cluster of friends that your dad actually and my
Yep,
dad became good friends, and we became friends through that. It was
that's
really
right.
pretty amazing, and so that's drawn me in. I found this really great community of acceptance, and it's extraordinarily powerful. And within that was the gifts of the Spirit. So I saw speaking in tongues when after I got saved, and the whole 9 yards. Oh, I need to speak in tongues too. And the first one I went to was this guy. I said, I tried to speak in tongues. He said, okay, he put his hands on my head, and he started speaking in tongues. And he said, okay, say banana. I said, what? He said, say banana. Okay, banana. No, repeat it. Banana, 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 banana. And trust me, if you're at home, just keep on repeating. You'll speak in tongues really quickly. Your tongue just trips over yourself. And I thought, oh, geez, that's just not for me. That's not legitimate. And like Scott, I went, no, this is not it. And so, anyways, I went to this other church because we would flop around to church and churches. This was also what we did. And it was this more artistic place, and it was a bunch of artists. And the guy there said, pray, would you like to speak in tongues? And I said, But there, it's interesting. The speak in tongues was like sort of like a wine taster for speaking in tongues. Like some churches are like, basically, like just baby talk. They have
Right.
the same
Yeah.
vowel. They're just going and putting different consonants on top of it, and very much baby talk. Babies kind of go through vowels. They learn vowels, but they learn consonants. They take them one at a time. And so, anyways, I went to this other church, and it was like it sounded like a language, and they were all arty people. Anyways, and this guy said, he said, pray with me. And he said, Gary, it's you can't force it. You have to let it happen. And there's nothing that's going to do that's going to make it happen. But you just have to be present and be aware. And you're just going to let it happen. And you're going to feel like you're an idiot. You're going to feel like you're just making it up. But you have to trust that stuff. And it's going to be this voice that has not spoken in a long time. And you got to let that voice. And this voice that has truth but doesn't have words because we don't understand the stuff that goes beyond our understanding, and it's going to voice the truth that you cannot understand. And that sounds really beautiful and kind of profound. And within weeks, I was like in my bed and just letting it happen, and it felt like it was true because I got euphoria while speaking in tongues. And I felt it wasn't me. Like I know I wasn't making it happen. It was definitely not coming from I wasn't making these things happen. It was
Right.
not conscious at all. I was kind of watching myself do it, and that felt real. And so I think in that world, that was a huge part of my faith because
Right.
it was kind of like proof. I have a tangible proof that I'm a Christian because I'm doing this thing that's I'm not making it happen. It's coming through me. And science could not ever explain that, you know. So that was it. And later on, I was an evangelical Christian for about, I guess, 7 or 8 years. And then I got really interested in the arts. And so I took this improvisational theater workshop. And my parents were like a little concerned that I was going to go into theater because theater for Christians is a dangerous place, you know. They're going to say, you know, you'll be playing drug addicts and prostitutes and all these things. And I go, oh, no, this is fine. This is just a fun improv class. So,
Right.
anyways, the teacher gets up and he gets people to improvise the first day. And he said, let's speak gibberish. And everybody's having a real tough time doing it. And then he says, okay, Gary, what's Gary? He's a gigolo. Okay, what's he doing? He's selling drugs. Okay, Gary's a drug. And then the teacher said, you know, and you can't just make it happen. You can't think it. You just have to be there, be present. Let this come from you. It's not gonna. If you think about it, it's gonna be a mess. Just let it come from deep within you. Almost exactly what the original tongue speaker said to me. And I'm not hearing that. I'm just going, yeah, okay. And I'm thinking gibberish. I'll do gibberish. And I did start speaking gibberish, and I was this like a Latin gigolo character talking to this girl. But I was hitting something really profound. Like I was doing the scene. I was truthful. It was real. And this guy was like creepy gibberish guy, but me as a Christian, I was like, this is kind of creepy. So I was really concerned with her as a human being, and I was in gibberish. I was telling her how beautiful she was and how wonderful she was, and honestly truthful. And he was getting emotional with it. Anyways, I did the scene, and I'm looking around, and people were like shocked at the scene for one, but people were like teary eyed because they were moved by it. And the teacher said, that was stunning. It looks like you've done improv your whole life. I go, no, this is the first time I've done a class.
And just so I can be clear, you said you were speaking gibberish, and you were not using your tongues. You were
Well, this is it. So I'm going home examining what happened.
right.
And I'm thinking, gosh, it came from that not thinking place, that place of just being present place. I was just being aware of the other person. I wasn't aware of myself. I was connecting to the other person, and it just came. And I went, oh my gosh, I've been speaking gibberish. And then the other time I said, oh my God, I've been improvising my whole life. I've been connecting,
Right.
I've been present my whole life. And I was being truthful my whole life. Because part of the other thing was a lot of times I would speak in tongues. And I remember praying for people who gone through pretty crisis thing. Somebody had been abused. And I just prayed in tongues, and I just got really emotional. I looked at her, I got vulnerable, and I spoke in tongues. I was crying, and she was so moved by what happened. It was like beautiful for her. She goes, yeah. I said, I don't think there's words for what you've experienced, but this is an emotional truth for what's going on. And there was this truthfulness to it. And so that's my condensed version. And I'm since became an atheist.
Yep.
I think I became an atheist kind of connected to speaking in tongues in the sense that my faith was all connected to these profound experiential things that I was able to do. And so my faith, belief in God was connected to these things and community. And then when I became an artist, I had community, I had tongues, I had this ability to be present. And it was a skill set that people, like in the arts world, it's really, really hard to not think. Like you have to be present and just be there. It's like anything you do, driving a car. You can't drive a car if you're thinking about driving a car. You have to think about where you're going, not what you're doing. If you think about what you're doing, it's like horrible. If you get into a new car and it's an icy road, you're thinking about the car and it's really horrible. But once you get your eyes off of the car, off of the steering wheel, off the tires and looking down the road, you can drive. And the tongues were for me, and was that I was looking down the road of what I was trying to do. I was looking down the road of this person going through trauma, and how do I bring compassion and speak compassion to her. And as a 16 or 15-year-old kid, I had no words. As a man, I had no words, but I had an emotional truth of trauma, of abuse, from bullies and stuff like that. And so I had a vulnerability that wasn't trapped by words. I had language and communication that was not trapped by words. It's really interesting now, specifically. There's so much awareness of language of how
Right.
language and colonialization and mansplaining and all that are connected to it. And there's this truth that you can go beyond that, which is without words, and you don't have all this kind of cultural baggage that comes along with it. So, in one sense, we were able to tap on some pretty profound things.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit later in this episode about some workshops you
Oh,
did
yes.
on speaking in tongues, but let's first dive into this phenomenon. What exactly is the speaking in tongues? And I think for some listeners, they will have all heard of it, but they may not have witnessed it, let alone practiced it. There's two kinds of speaking in tongues. They're both mentioned in the Bible, but the modern church is not doing either of them correctly. So they're speaking in tongues to other people for their benefit, and then they're speaking in tongues privately for your own benefit. And the first one, you're doing it for other people's benefit. So it's supposedly a language that they will recognize, right? It'll be, you speak German to German people and you speak Italian to Italian people. These are languages that they recognize. And as you speak, those people can understand exactly what you're saying, even though you're speaking a language you've never learned. That's what you find, for example, in Acts chapter 2. You've got all these people, and they mention a long list of languages that these people who are, speaking in tongues, they're talking Arabic and they're talking Lebanese and they're talking, Roman and Greek and all kinds of other languages. But you never see that in today's modern church. I don't know, Gary, have you ever seen that? Or for that matter, Scott, have you ever seen that or heard people talk that they've ever witnessed this happening?
No.
No, I didn't. But strangely enough, people told me that I did. But it was because my gibberish was that good that they thought they were hearing this language.
Did they name what it was?
They said German. There you go. They thought, Gary, I'm German because I think I understood some, and probably they did understand some because I had heard some German. And so,
Right.
und zweitens reden da, ja, das und durch da. So I was, yeah, and hasn't sprechen schnell. So I probably said something like that, and they would heard it. I mean, I can do the same thing in English, like Scottish, a British good at any bucket anybody. I thought you want to consider alone. And so people go, they think I'm speaking their language, and they go, I just can't quite understand it. He's got too thick of an accent.
Yeah.
So this person told me that, and I went, wow. And but they just heard me saying a bunch of words that I probably overheard by watching, a movie or
Right.
Hogan's Heroes.
It's interesting to note as well that not only have I not seen that phenomenon in modern churches, but even in the New Testament itself, it's more or less a one-off.
Right.
What Paul talks about in books like Corinthians and so on, when he talks about the spiritual gifts and stuff like that, I really don't think he's referring to the same thing at all of what happened in Acts. And it's too bad that we conflate those two things, because what happened in Acts, I don't think is strictly speaking what is referred to as speaking in tongues. It was obviously a miraculous event that demonstrated the universality of the Christian message. I mean, that's what's going on there. Whether you believe it or not, that's the point, right? But the gift of tongues that Paul refers to so often, and it's primarily Paul, I think in the New Testament that talks about it, is quite a different thing. So, yeah.
So that's one version of speaking in tongues. And actually, there's a scientific name for it. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's xenolalia. Scientists, they've divided this up according to the claims that are made. And xenolalia is the kind of tongues where you're actually speaking a human language that you've never learned ever before. And we'll talk more about that. But then there's this other kind of speaking in tongues, which, this is the one that Paul will talk a lot about. It's glossolalia, speaking in a language that nobody seems to be able to do anything with. It's tongues that you're doing for yourself privately. It's a language that you don't recognize and nobody around you recognizes. It's just, they'll refer to it as a heavenly language, kind of like, Lord of the Rings, where you've got some people speaking human and some people speaking elf, or there's, Star Trek and the Klingon language and human language, that kind of thing. Did you know that there's a Klingon version of the Bible, by the way?
Yes.
Yes,
there's a Bible written in Klingon, yeah. But I've got to say that it's just too convenient to say, well, it doesn't sound like a language because it's a heavenly language. Nobody can understand it because it's not an earthly language. That's just too convenient.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that. So I think that was kind of powerful for me, that I was accessing the profoundness of spirituality, the heavenly language. Yeah, that I was able to tap into God's language, spirit language. So it's. And then part of the belief system, if you deny that, you're denying the Holy Spirit. Like you're judging the Holy Spirit. Like if they were like me, you do not feel that you're very present in when it's happening. You're watching it happen. You are removed from it. So then there's no reason to believe that it is anything other than what they say that it is. And I think it feels like it is, though. Emotionally, I got very emotionally moved when I was doing it. As for myself, yeah, when I was going through like moments where I did not know what to say, I had lost language. I would speak in tongues because I have no idea. A friend was my dad was dying, and I had no language for that. So
Right.
Well, that's an interesting point that you're raising, Gary. I think it's really fascinating that you talk about it allowed you to express, in a sense, express the inexpressible. And I wonder if there's something, and maybe Luke, you'll address this on the science side of things, but is there something cathartic about that? Because so often in life, we do have experiences that, I mean, language is our main tool of expression, obviously, right? But if we encounter some level of grief or joy, for that matter, that can't be expressed in language, does this offer an outlet that otherwise wouldn't be available? I just think that's kind of interesting from a psychological perspective.
yeah, I think totally is a beautiful outlet. I mean, in the same sense, for myself as an artist, dance becomes an abstract way of expressing an emotional truth.
Mm.
Right.
Poetry, you're either you're using language, you're pulling it away from logic and pulling away from concreteness in that sense, and then it becomes something beautiful. Music is a great way of.
Yeah.
We all get very moved by music,
Yes.
and that's an
Right.
abstract way of taking tones. And singing changes what you were saying. And you can make the most beautiful stuff. I mean, that's why. What was it? Sting song, Police song. I'll be watching you. Sounds like it's sung so beautifully. It doesn't sound like a stalker song.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So I think there's this beauty in that, and we don't have a very much of an access to do with language, and so in
Right.
one sense, language becomes another way of taking the abstract idea of truth, and we're so connected to emotions when we're speaking.
Right. And I do want to come back to that.
Yeah.
But let's finish going into this deep dive. And here I'm going to go all Cliff Clavin on you guys. Sorry. But I was exploring when I did the background on this because I really was my interest was piqued, Gary, when I talked to you a few weeks ago after your show, and I looked into this, and I found out it is not a purely Christian phenomenon. I had thought it was, and I heard little rumblings that okay, maybe there's other versions of it, but those are counterfeits, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But when I did the research, it is not at all a Christian phenomenon. I'm going to go through a list here, and I'm not just simply trying to overwhelm the listeners with a lot of unorganized facts. There's two or three main points that I want to impress on the listeners to see that this glossolalia, which is that's what you hear in churches today, it is not at all a Christian thing. It went on in Greek and Roman contexts many centuries before Christianity and in settings that had no connection at all with the Old Testament. Plato, the Greek philosopher from the 5th century BC, he refers to it several times. And so does Virgil, the Roman poet from the 1st century BC. And that's because this glossolalia was part of a certain ancient Greek and Roman religions from that era. The Eleusinian and the Dionysian and the Orphic mystery religions and the ancient cults of Mithra and Osiris. And it was practiced by oracles and priestesses referred to as Sibyls and Pythias, who prophesied while under this trance. But listen to this, as far back as the 10th and 11th century BC, that's what they were talking about, this glossolalia in these ancient Greek and Roman religions. And then the second main point I want to go through now is in modern times. This phenomenon has been found in religions all around the world, religions that you would not connect to the Christian version unless you really, really blur the distinctiveness between Christianity and those other religions. So grab a globe or a map, a world map, and let's start with the Americas, North America, Central America, and South America. Listen to this. Glossolalia has been studied by linguists and anthropologists in the peyote cult among the North American Indians, the Haida Indians of the Pacific Northwest, the Eskimos of the subarctic regions, the Shago cult in Haiti, the Chaco Indians of South America, and in the curanderos of the Andes. That's the Americas. Now let's go over to Africa. Scientists have found glossolalia in the Kinka shamans of Sudan and in the Tonga region of the east coast of Africa, the Shango cult of the west coast of Africa, and the Zora cult of Ethiopia. And then we go over to Asia and Australia. They found glossolalia again in the Eskimos, but now in the subarctic regions of Asia. The shamans in Greenland and in Siberia, the Tibetan monks, the Dayaks of Borneo, and the Aborigines of Australia. So you got to be honest, this is not a Christian phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. I mean, it totally makes sense. And
One thing I find fascinating, but through what you're saying there, Luke, as far as the history of it goes, is that where you don't seem to find it much is in the Judaism of the first century or the Old Testament. You don't really, it doesn't really come out there. It seems to be something that comes into this picture with the integration of Judaism when Judaism expands out to Gentiles, right? So this is something. Yeah. So it's not surprising to me that many of these Gentiles would be coming from mystery cults, and that they would then appropriate a practice that they were used to, and it seems like that. For example, Paul is quite comfortable with that. No different than a sense that you find worship music in all religions, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? So I guess what I'm hearing you say, just you can maybe clarify it, is that it's not necessarily a quote miraculous or supernatural thing. It's a very human thing. Early Christianity appropriated it for its own purposes, as it did many other things in the ancient world.
Right.
But going to Gary, to your earlier point, that for you, tongues held kind of this supernatural place, and once you kind of came to the realization, wow, there's really not, it's really quite a natural thing, that was part of your moving away from faith at all, right? Am I right in that?
Yeah, that was a big part of that faith journey out of it. It was because some of the things I attributed to belief, this faith, were becoming naturalized or humanized or demythologized.
Demythologized. Yeah.
Thank you. I knew there was a word there.
I know the pushback that I've often heard from Christians. They'll say that these are just counterfeits. And they'll sometimes even go so far as to say these are demonic counterfeits of what goes on in Christianity. But the fact is, the history shows that this was happening literally centuries. In that one case, ancient Greek religions, it goes back a millennium before Christianity. Before it can't be a counterfeit of something that happened 1,000 years later. If nothing else, then the Christian version of the speaking in tongues is it's a Christian counterfeit of an ancient Greek ritual, right?
Yeah, in one sense, Christianity is a Greek religion, in that sense, because it doesn't hold a lot to connect it to what Judaism is. It became very, very Greekified, Romified, and those philosophies made sense. So when you said that, I went, oh gosh, that makes so much sense that they were really influenced by Greek and Roman culture.
Yeah, in so many ways. Yeah.
Yes.
Which is, I think, one other part of the success of Christian faith was its willingness to do that, to integrate with the thing. Because if it hadn't, it probably would have just remained a very obscure mystery sect or something, But it was quite comfortable with, in a sense, we talk a lot about appropriation these days. Well, it was comfortable with appropriating certain things from other faiths and so on. But then I like to say baptizing them, giving them a Christian meaning and so on. So I think that actually lent a lot to the success of the spreading of Christianity.
Please indulge me for a moment while I pitch a proposal to you, the audience. If you're enjoying these episodes, and the fact that you're this far into the episode suggests to me that you do, then I'd like to ask for something in return. No, not your money, but your support nonetheless. What we ask is that you help our podcast by leaving likes and comments at our Facebook pages and website to increase traffic to our site. And even better, share this with one or more of your friends who you know are also wrestling with faith issues and their evangelical roots. Such a small effort on your part could easily double our audience. I hope you agree that this is worth promoting. And now, back to the episode. Now, I made reference to linguists and anthropologists. These are people who study language. They study humans and humans using language. This is what they do for a career. And I want to talk a bit about a few really interesting papers and a lot of material on this whole speaking in tongues from these linguists and anthropologists. So these scientists have developed techniques that allow them to decode other previously unknown languages, either from Aboriginal groups that they encounter, living people, or archaeological artifacts with writing on them. And that's how we've become able to translate ancient Egyptian and Babylonian artifacts, for example. Or we now occasionally bump into tribes that have been long cut off. They've kept themselves cut off from the rest of the world, and they speak a whole different language. And so these linguists and anthropologists can go in there and study the language. They'll identify patterns and rules in the speech, and they're always trying to pull out a vocabulary from that unknown language. And in the process, they end up learning how to speak to these people who've been cut off, or to decipher some of these artifacts we find from ancient Babylon, for example. And then, as an aside, then Bible translators go in and use those same rules and vocabulary to produce Bibles for those people. So these linguists and anthropologists have dissected this phenomenon of speaking in tongues. They've actually looked at glossolalia. And what they find, or actually what they don't find, is they find no patterns, no rules, and a very simple vocabulary, basically baby talk. That's what Gary was saying earlier in the episode. One study was done by Dr. Heather Cavan, a PhD in religious studies at Massey University in New Zealand. And I love the main title of one of her papers. The title is, this is the title, "We Don't Know What We're Saying, but It's Profound." I love that.
I do.
She's obviously quoting the people that she studied. She did over 500 hours of fieldwork in Pentecostal and charismatic meetings. She made recordings of them, and then she analyzed them. And one of the observations she made about speaking in tongues there is that it's characterized by a lot of repetition, alliteration, and assonance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what do these three words mean? And Gary, I'm going to call on you to give us examples of this because you seem to do it so well. So I'll launch into here. So by repetition, she means just that simple repetition of a word or a phrase.
Yeah. And we used to joke about it. We would go, there's different churches. There's the Habadaba Namadadas, like the Yabadabadu, which is the Flintstones. So Yamanada, Habadaba Namadabadabadu. And then there was the Japanese cards. Shandala, Tandala, Handala, Tanda, Toyota, Hatatala, Tanda. So there was a Hatada Handanana. That was connection to that. And there was this definitely repetition of those sounds that we'd hear everywhere we go. And like I was saying earlier, that they would do a continual vowel sound. Amanatapa halaka samaniyadapa. So it is just playing with the It's very hard to change vowel consonants. Your brain.
Right.
You can riff on vowels, or you can riff on consonants, but riff on both things is kind of a harder thing to do. And so it's easy, and it feels like is a. So I was just thinking that in language, also as a playwright, I'm interested in vowel sounds, and so there's different vowel sounds that happen based on how you're emotionally feeling, and so. Oh, I'm sorry. It is OE words, and the ah words, and or swearing, for example. Swearing is always spitting, right?
Mm.
So I don't have to understand a language to know they're swearing. I can just go, what the fuck? Oh, she's swearing at me, whatever language that was in. So there's things that we do with language, the emotional shape of it that connects to it. So then there's this emotional language that makes sense. So the ah sound is similar why we sing ahs in music. The ahs, oohs, e's. We're not going to e sounds is much more. If you had e, it's kind of eerie. We say eerie for a reason because e sound has this kind of a more of a jarring sound to us. And so if you're singing a song with lots of e's or doing the ee sound, it's different than the o sounds and the ah sounds. And if you remember Space Odyssey 2001, they were not doing ahs and ohs. They were sound with that weird vocalizations that were doing that was just giving everybody the creeps.
Right, yeah.
And so I think in that sense, it was a language we didn't understand. They were doing sort of that world. Right. Yeah, so I think it makes there's this connection to the vowel sounds that are emotional that make a lot of sense to people. So yeah.
All right. Okay, so Gary, when I read this paper from Heather Cavan, she used these three words, repetition, alliteration, and assonance, and you gave your understanding of what those mean. Yeah. What she was getting at with the repetition is just simply that, like people saying the same word. I think one of you was saying how when you were taught how to speak in tongues, you were told just go banana, 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 just repeat it. Making up words, Bilamon, Bilamon, Bilamon. That's what many people will do when they're speaking in tongues. They repeat the same word or the same sound, actually, as opposed to alliteration. And I think, Gary, some of your examples were more what they call alliteration, where you're using the same sound at the beginning or at the end of every word. And so examples of alliteration that people are going to recognize are things like Sally sells seashells by the seashore, right? That kind of thing. Peter Piper packed a pack of pickled peppers. That's alliteration. Yes. But people do that when they're speaking in tongues as well. And then this assonance is basically it's a different kind of repetition. It's a repetition of the form of similar sounds. And the only example that I could come up with, it's actually in a song from Pink Floyd, Grantchester Meadows. There's one line in the song, Hear the lark and hearken to the barking of the dark fox gone to ground.
Right.
So that's an example of assonance. Hear the lark and hearken to the barking of the dark fox gone to ground. And so this Heather Cavan looked at all these recordings, 500 hours, and she analyzed them and broke it down and found that it's just a lot of this repetition, this assonance and this alliteration, and no vocabulary. She would tabulate all the number of combinations of sounds and make those essentially words. And she said there's a very limited number of words in these vocabularies.
Yeah, definitely. Like, and I would suggest that was 90% of it. But if she went to probably an artsy church, they would have a lot more varieties of language.
You said a what church?
A church with a lot of artists.
Artiste.
When I was in Youth with a Mission, we went to an art school. Our speaking tongues was pretty weird, pretty out there. You know, I heard somebody doing from the clicking sound that is in South Africa, and right. All these things that go out there. They were because they were hearing all these languages, and then they were going through them and saying them back. So
now you've hit on something there, Gary, because another thing that Heather Cavan found in her studies, she said that when she looked at the range of the sounds, it's a small range, and I'm not getting at the vocabulary. This is now the range of sounds, and you have to listen to this carefully. She said that the sounds tend to be the same ones used in the speaker's native language, and tend not to be the sounds that are not found in the speaker's native language. I'll say that one more time, and then I'll give you an example. So she found that the sounds that people would use in these 500 hours of recordings, these Pentecostal and charismatic speakers, the sounds tend to be the same ones used in the speaker's native language, and they tend not to be the sounds that are not found in the speaker's native language. Now, an example. I'm English. I'm North American English. The English that I speak does not have the rolling R's that you find in Scottish. It does not have the pronounced nasal sounds that you find in Italian or French, and it doesn't have, those really harsh staccato sounds of Mandarin Chinese. And so if I wasn't aware of that, my speaking in tongues probably wouldn't have those rolling R's and nasal sounds and staccato. But people from those areas, they would have those sounds in their. And so what the conclusion then is that these people that are doing the speaking in tongues, they're just drawing from muscle memory built up around their own vocal speech.
Yeah, and I was like that when I was watching people like doing the banana nana nana, but I was judging their tongues, like that doesn't seem very tongue-like to me. It wasn't. It definitely that. I was like, I think they're speaking gibberish. I especially later into before I stopped believing altogether. I was watching these people and going, why aren't they able to speak in tongues like I do, like with a variative language that sounded like made people believe I was speaking German or whatever language it was. And I realized it was because of their understanding of how much they could let go, if you know what I mean, how present they could be, and how far away from their center they could be. And they felt like, so they could do that vowel sounds and the namadanada or the shandala. Shandala was a big word I heard all the time. Shandala hitanamata pakatamate, shandala hutele. And that would be about all of it.
So do you think there was when you get a group together, of course there's peer pressure, right? So if people start to have these experiences and other people feel like they should be having these experiences, then do you feel that there's a lot of that going on where it's kind of in a sense they're faking it because they're trying to participate in the.
I don't know if they're faking it, but I think they hear this other language and the world gets opened up of what it could sound like.
Okay.
And if everybody goes ta 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 pa ka ka pa pa pa, you're gonna go, I guess that's what speaking in tongues sounds like.
Okay.
But if you hear they go, that's what it sounds like.
Okay.
And so I think it's more about that repetition that babies do, the mimicking that babies do. That babies, like what Luke was saying, you would mimic the sound. Baby sounds in different countries sound different. They have sounds that they can do. My wife is Chinese, and her baby talk was Chinese at the beginning.
Right.
And she has access to languages and words and sounds in here that I do not have access to.
And one other thing that this doctor Heather Cavan found, Gary, you've actually done it in these examples you've given us, but I don't think you've articulated what she found. What she found was that there's a varied cadence and the rhythm of normal speech. When you speak normally, you have a rhythm and a cadence. But what she found in these speaking in tongues, it was very highly regular, very repetitive, and very staccato. And I heard that when you were giving these examples, very chop, 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 chop.
Yeah. And I'll get into this later, but when I teach speaking in tongues, I get them to connect it to the breath. Okay. Which we don't do. We have with the breath as a part of it, but a big part of it is our communication. But when you're doing it like this, like if you do mantras or any of that vocalizations that you want to do, you connect it to the breath. So you do the breath
Yeah.
is your meter for that. And
But
so,
even what I heard you just do there, Gary, well, not that you're trying to speak in tongues, you're trying to do this for the theater, but what I heard you there was you are doing it in the in a breath. You're
right.
going with the breath, but there was a regular staccato within
Yes,
that,
yes,
right?
yes,
So
yes.
now, I was going to get into another scientific study, but I don't want to. I think we're running out of time. But I'll just, for those who want to look into this, this is an anthropologist named Felicitas Goodman. She's now passed away, but she looked at speaking in tongues in a number of communities in Ohio and Texas, with comparisons to people in Brazil and Japan, Indonesia, and some in Africa. And to make a long story short, she looked at Christian versus non Christian speakers from these various regions: Ohio and Texas, Brazil and Japan, and Indonesia. And what she found was that there was no difference between them. That countering this claim that people say, well, that's just a counterfeit of what happens in Christian speaking. Well, no, she looked at this and broke it down and said there's no difference between the two forms of speaking in tongues.
Hmm.
Okay, so then let's move on. Here's a natural question one might ask: what is the point of speaking words that no one understands? I think that's a reasonable question, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So why would we then speak in tongues in a language that no one understands?
I can speak from my personal experience because I carried on speaking in tongues after I stopped believing that was real, because I like the therapeutic value of it, and so I think speaking in tongues has this way to connect to and voice some of the deeper things that we're going through that we just don't have words for. So I think it's that wordlessness that you can add to something, and the therapy that happens while speaking it. I think it's hugely therapeutic to speak in tongues because
Hmm?
there's this emotional thing that's happening to you. Yeah, the world is going crazy, and all of a sudden you're in this zone where this thing is happening, and you're part of it. You're not observe. You're observer of yourself, which is a rare thing. We don't get to observe ourselves very often,
Right.
but we can observe ourselves doing this act that becomes quite profound. And in sense of like earlier said, similar to riding a car, once you get good at it, you can really pull yourself out and observe yourself doing what
Right.
you're doing. And I think that's a very profound thing to do.
When you were talking, Gary, I think about something like music. I mean, music, I can see a real parallel between kind of music and speaking in tongues in the sense that
Yeah.
music can be so powerful. It can carry you to a place that is euphoric and the words can't really express. And music can be like nobody would say that music is limited to religious worship, right? We have tended to do that with tongues. We tend to say, oh, tongues, well, that's a religious thing. But religions use music and non-religions use music. Atheists enjoy music as much as Christians enjoy music. So the phenomenon of music is universal. And I think what I'm hearing Gary say, and maybe what we're saying as a group, is that this idea of tongues is kind of a universal human phenomenon. Christians have used it and directed it in a certain fashion, but that doesn't mean that others can't use it as well for other reasons. Is that fair, Gary?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah.
What I had heard back in the day when I was in those circles, I was told that they serve a function, and the function is basically to somehow open up a channel between you and or your own spirit and or God. Somehow there's some kind of a dialogue going on there, and you're basically the puppet. You're the one who's doing all the talking, but somehow there's a dialogue going on between your spirit and God. And it was supposed to be for your strengthening. We had this word edification, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me when I was thinking about that and doing some of this research, it was a provocative question, actually, that again pointed to the idea that this speaking in tongues is really just an innate ability that humans have. And the question was this: if the purpose of tongues is personal edification, spiritually speaking, from a Christian point of view, why don't people get the gift of playing a musical instrument to help them worship and feed their soul? Why? I mean, you know how you were talking earlier about how important music and singing are to the spiritual experience, and music can be so moving. Why can't people just pick up the violin or the piano and just start leading in worship? It just doesn't ever happen. But that would really be personally edifying. Why don't we regularly hear about people being able to recite passages from scripture that they've never read before? Again, that would be really personally edifying. Or rather than speaking in an unknown language, why don't we hear about people suddenly being given the gift of speaking through sign language with their hands? You just don't hear that.
Right.
So it kind of blows for me, it blows that idea that it's meant for personal edification.
Well, I think the other thing too, in Pentecostal and charismatic circles, there's at least maybe not. It's changing, and I realize that, but there is kind of this idea that tongues is for everybody. Everybody really should speak in tongues. I mean, that's the history. Now I know that's not true of many groups now, but that's the history of it. And what you're saying, Luke, I think, is that there's many other gifts that we don't say that about. We don't say that everybody should be gifted.
Exactly.
Right. Everybody should be gifted musically. Everybody should be gifted dramatically. Everybody should be gifted in the visual arts. We recognize that those are very specific things. So yeah, am I hearing you correct?
Absolutely. This whole gifting thing is only related to speaking, to vocalization. And by the way, that's why I think it's so present in so many other religions, not just Christianity. We know scientifically how uniquely a human ability it is to have these built-in cognitive mechanisms for speech. We're born with that ability. Babies spontaneously begin to make sounds, and they copy sounds spontaneously. I can tell you from personal experience, I have 4 kids and a couple grandkids, and it's stunning. It's mind-boggling to listen to this 6-month-old child babble in some built-in language. It's a built-in language of some kind, and it's just mind-blowing. And it's just in us this built-in cognitive mechanism that evolves on its own. And there are examples of horrible abuse where children are raised for many years in nearly complete isolation from other people, and they develop a language. It's just built into them to develop a language. Stories I hear of twins that sometimes will have a little unique little language between the two of them. They just do it. It's human. But we don't have a built-in mechanism for playing pianos or guitars. We don't have a built-in mechanism for scripture, like an instinct for memory of scripture. We don't have a built-in neural pathway for sign language, but we do have a built-in cognitive ability for speech. And it just happens to be that this gift is always about speaking in a language that you never learned before.
Yeah. I mean, there is that, but there is also that other one that is singing in the spirit, which is another thing that happens. If people aren't familiar with that, they're at the church service and they've sung a prayer song and everybody's quiet. And all of a sudden this sort of murmur happens. And everybody starts singing at the same time in different melodies, in different tunes. And it all goes, it sounds like an orchestra warming up. And it's really beautiful, like really, really beautiful. Some of the most beautiful things I've ever heard is singing in spirit, because it's really, and what's really interesting is that you have some people who are really good at harmonizing, and so they'll harmonize, and other people are not good at anything, and they're just plowing through. And there's this, so in the middle of all this chaos, there's these harmonizers who are making sense of some strange things. And it gets super, super complicated if you try to musicalize it. But it is really profound because there's enough mixture of people that are following along with what everybody else is doing, somebody else barging through, and somebody else harmonizing all of that. And humanity. And I was listening to it, I was like later on when I stopped believing, I was at that service because my parents were still believers. And I was listening going, gosh, this is beautiful. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And I think I can lead this into why I teach speaking in tongues comes out of this actually. Yeah. So what you're talking about, the built-in mechanism, the scans with the MRI when people are speaking in tongues, it comes from a different part of the brain than the traditional logic speak, and I can identify where it's coming from because I can identify where it's happening when I'm improvising.
You can identify where it's happening. What do you mean by that?
It's different. It comes from a different place in my brain than I speak from.
And you can sense that.
Sense that it's not the same connection emotionally or logically, because I can logically think of what I'm saying. My brain that chatters is the one that's speaking right now, and the brain that chatters is going, "Holy crap, what am I saying right now?" So I can hear my internal voice talking while the other one is talking and doing that thing. So I'm almost. I mean, I don't. It feels like a different part of my brain, a different way of my brain working. I mean, the same thing like we've all done. You do a job, and it all of a sudden your brain starts doing it. Whatever it is, like I just changed phones, and my brain had to rework to figure out how to move buttons. And because
Right.
before I just thought about it, and then I have to now think about it. So my iPhone brain is different than my PC brain. In sense, there's this assemblage of how I work with it, and it's way more extreme with things like speaking in tongues because it comes from the part of my brain that's intuitive and connective, and when I'm being a creative artist.
So it's interesting that you use the word creative because as I'm listening to you talk, Gary and Luke, creativity seems to be a thread through this.
Yeah.
There's a great story Leonard Cohen told about a conversation with Bob Dylan that he had. Leonard Cohen, of course, wrote unbelievable poetry and eventually music, but he struggled terrifically doing that. Like it would take him, sometimes years to write a poem or whatever. He was talking to Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan says, "Oh, it's not me. I wrote 'Blowing in the Wind' in a car trip." I mean, I'm not sure if it literally was blowing, but you know what I mean. And so Dylan talks about the fact that, in fact, it's part of his faith, really, because he talks about how his music is purely a gift. It's handed to him. He doesn't come from a conscious center. It just appears. And now we would say he's gifted. So it seems that there's some people have an ability to tap into these things more than maybe others do. And I'm wondering, Gary, in your experience, do you feel that your ability to speak in tongues and your experience of helping other people do so, are some people able to do it better than others, or is it easier for some people than others?
I think it's definitely easier for some people to do than others. And other people are I think you become a charismatic evangelical Christian because that's easier for you to do and live in that world.
Mm-hmm.
Either be around it or do it.
Okay.
And other people go, "Oh, I tried it, but it really wasn't for me." Yeah, they couldn't let go as such.
Okay.
I definitely like the Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen difference. Leonard Cohen thinks through his poems, and Dylan just it spews out. But Dylan spends a lot more time thinking before he ever thinks about writing. He thinks he reads or he listens to a ton of music. He talked about having his music library was extraordinarily huge. And he listened to everything. He was just eternally curious. So he's now, I believe, writing while he's listening. He's writing because he listened to this person. He listens to that person. He goes there. He goes there. All that's part of the writing thing. And then when he sits down, he just regurgitates what he's done. And so, but he's filled with all these melodies and tunes and ideas that he's not consciously stealing from, but consciously growing out of. And so that's I work with artists who work with those two different ways, and it's very hard to put those two people together in the same room.
It's really interesting to hear you say that. I am no Bob Dylan, but I do some writing and I do a little bit of poetry, and that's exactly what you're describing is exactly how I operate. I'll research in an area, just and not thinking about anything I'm particularly going to say or anything like that. But then when it comes time, and I usually need pressure when it comes time to I got to produce something. It's just that all of a sudden it starts to come out. It seems like it's coming out of nowhere, but it really isn't, right? And so that's interesting. I've never heard about that about Dylan, but I could definitely see that. Yeah.
And I think the idea of pressure is a really good addition to that. You have all this thing you have to do and this pressure to do it. And so pressure, you just don't think. You go, I just got to do it. I have to. You don't. If you have time, you think. If you don't have time, you do. And so I think part of that is connected to speaking in tongues or any of that. I'm not thinking.
Right.
And I think there's this sort of denigration of doing. Oh, he doesn't think about it. He just does it. No. I was just watching the Ringo Starr talking about how he does what he does, and he says. Just a bunch of times, and he doesn't read music, and he does this thing, and then the other one was from U2, the drummer from U2, Larry Mullen, says he's never taken lessons in his life, and he doesn't want to take lessons because he's doing things differently than other people, and it's hard for people to there's this drum course you can take how to play, and it's really hard to play like Larry Mullen from U2 because he wasn't trained, so he does things wrong, but it's not wrong, obviously, but he does it not the way you would do it.
Very successful.
Wow. Very successful. And so a lot of these artists come from a point of view that they've listened to music and they haven't studied it, but they've digested it. And the same thing that happens with any of those gifts. You digest sound and digest music, and then you can be present for it coming out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Gary, I wanted to come back to something you said a few moments ago, how when you speak in tongues, you say it comes from a different part of your brain, completely different from the where you normally speak from. And that's one thing that was found in that study. We were talking earlier about the brain studies, the MRI, the functional MRI. For people who want to look into this, just look for the name Andy Newberg. He's at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and he did this fMRI study. Gary and Scott have already talked a bit about that. But the one thing I did want to say was they were talking how the brain activity was lower in those regions that you expect to be active in normal speech. Gary made a reference to that. Okay, so the sounds weren't coming from the brain's built-in dictionary. You had this lexicon, and the sounds that you're making with your mouth are not coming from that part of your brain. That's the same area that has the vocabulary. It's got the rules that determine English versus the rules that determine Mandarin Chinese, whole different set of rules. So then that raises a provocative question. Where is it coming from? What part of your brain is it coming from? And of course, the people speaking in tongues will say it's coming from the Holy Spirit. Okay, fine. Maybe. If that's what you want to say, that's fine. But then again, maybe it's coming from that muscle memory that I referred to earlier. And maybe it's being triggered by yet other areas that normally are not involved in speech. And I'll give you an example of this kind of thing happening. Scientists refer to this as plasticity. Your brain can rewire itself. People who go blind can start to use the visual parts of their brain to process sounds from the ear and connect those inputs to the brain, the part of the brain that builds up this spatial awareness of your environment. And so they begin to echolocate. These people will echolocate using those visual parts of their brain the same way that bats do. They can learn how to connect the nerves in their fingertips, the pressure sensors in your fingers, and turn bumps into words and connect that to the language center. So just by moving your hand across a page, you can do something. You rewire your brain to do that. People who have a stroke or spinal injury and they've lost various physical abilities, they can relearn those abilities using new connections to new brain areas. So my point in all that is your brain can do that. It can connect parts of the brain that are not normally used for a certain job and plug them in and use them for that new job.
I have a quote from Newberg that might fit in here well, Luke.
Sure.
Just on the functional MRI stuff, Newberg says the glossolalia brain function appears to be more similar to other trance-like states in which the frontal lobe activity diminishes as the person loses their sense of purposely performing the practice. So as it becomes more that, like you've talked about, Gary, that automatic thing that it's more similar to like a trance-like almost state that they observe in people in meditation, for example, or other dissociative types of behaviors.
Yeah, for sure. And as an artist, you kind of want to get into that trance state. As an artist, if you're creating music, you want to get into that trance state of just doing it, of that weird, that you're not, what's the word? What's the word? What's the next word kind of crap,
Yeah. So what might those other brain areas be? Those parts of the brain that are now plugged in to do this pseudo speech that sounds like speech. It's just not real speech. We have areas in our brain that are random generators. They produce random firings. That's what we use in part. That's what you use when you're brainstorming, when you come up with entirely new ideas. You're using these random, spurious nerve firings. That's where we get our creativity and our innovation. You were talking about that earlier. This is also where we get our free will. I mean, how do you finally decide? You've got the cooler with the 18 cans of Coke in front of you, and you pick one of the 18 cans are identical. There's no reason to pick the one that you do, and you could spend forever trying to decide why you should pick one and not the other. But your brain just says, pick that one. It's a random generator that gets you moving. Otherwise, you'd be tied up in knots trying to make decisions. And I'm guessing that these are the same areas that control scribbling on paper. When you scribble on paper, something's telling the pen to go there, but you're not doing it consciously. It's just random firings. Yeah. Or dad dancing. That really embarrassing form of dance that people who have no training like me, and you're dancing, nerves are firing, something's controlling those, but it's not a thought process. This is we have these brain areas that will do that. They will send out these random firings, and you use that. You can plug them in to do this, that, or the other thing. Yeah. And maybe this is what's happening in speaking in tongues.
Yeah, I totally think that's, which I think what makes it, as an atheist, makes it so profound, because it is profound. You are able to tap into something that you're not trained to do typically.
Right.
in your regular world. And every so often you get this chance to go into that special place. If you're writing
Yeah.
academic papers, for example, you go, how often do I get there? But all of a sudden, you do the summary at the end or the intro, and you go, oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not the hardcore word. How do I summate this? And all of a sudden you do it. That's that part of the brain. And depending on your job description, you get to live there sometimes a bit of the time, or as an artist, kind of you get paid to go there all the time. They want you to live there.
Right. Okay. So that's how tongue
Yeah.
seems to be happening.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about why people might speak in tongues, and we talked a little bit about what tongues are for. But Gary, you've found this new application, this application I'd never heard of before, doing workshops, teaching, speaking in tongues to people in the theater arts.
Yeah.
I was blown away. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that actually came from talking to a colleague who teaches at a university. And I just talked about my background with speaking in tongues and this. And I said, oh, and I talked about singing in the spirit. And I explained to her why it was so beautiful. She said, you should come and do that with it. Do you think you could teach my students to do that? And I just like, it was like, please do not put my worlds together like that. Like, she was a good friend. I don't want to go out. I don't want to out myself. And I said, let me think about that. And then I went, yeah, I think I can do that. I think I can teach you how to do this. And so I said, yeah, I'll do a class with you. And so I came up to the students and I said, I told them a bit about my background. I was an evangelical Christian who used to speak in tongues. And then I said, but what speaking other tongues is a common thing. A lot of cultures do that, but often it's relegated to the shamans or the spiritual leaders or the spirits or the witches or whatever it is of that group that you go. We have a rarefied group that does this, and every so often there's a larger religion that they all kind of go there. And so, anyways, I said that's it, and I said I'm going to use some of the similar language that I use, but. And I'm not doing this cynically, but I'm going to use some of this language to help you visualize it. And then I just sort of talk them through it. I take out spirituality, but everything else is there about coming to quiet themselves down. And you're going to speak a voice that has not spoken in a long time. And this is your truer, deeper self that's going to speak. And it's not going to have words, but it's going to have sound. And it's not going to have sense, but it's going to have meaning. It's not going to have understanding, but it's going to have emotional truth. And I talked there, and I started talking about this voice that's not spoken in a while. I said, there's this voice that you have speaking that tells you you're dumb, you're stupid. This is, that voice that there's a way that tells you this is dumb and all that stuff. And I said, you need to stop that voice. And then I go in a very emotional place with them. I said, I'm not doing this cynically, but I am doing it as an actor, and I will go in an emotional place. And I get very emotional with them and talk about how beautiful it can be and how let this voice that had not spoken in a long time. And I'll often get teary-eyed with them as part of the process of getting them to go to a vulnerable place. And then I get them to quiet themselves, lay down, and I said to start with a breath. Just do a vowel sound of some sort, and give it a percussion. I said, now give it like you're giving it sound, let it happen, but now give it a truth. Now give it a voice. Now give it an emotional truth, an emotional voice, and give it allow this voice that has not spoken in a long time, this voice that loves you, that cares for you, that has not spoken in a long time. Let it a chance to come out. And they start going there, and I spend a while talking to them, and I kind of follow the room, and they go there and go quite emotionally, and they start singing, and two of the groups did it, actually spontaneously started singing.
Really?
Yeah, started speaking. Like just somebody started making a little bit of a melody, and I said, "Go, yes, go with that." And now I guess we can do that. Yeah, sure. And everybody kind of went with it, and they all started following, and all of a sudden they started doing it, and it was really, really beautiful. And I got really emotional when I saw that happen naturally. I went, "Oh, I didn't think they would start speaking in tongues, like singing in the spirit," but they did. And after it's finished, I go up, and then everybody's there, and all these people are like what, like they just had a big cry and a big hug and a deep sleep, kind of that they were like light, and people said, "Oh my God, that was beautiful." And people of friends of mine, her girlfriend said that she speaks in tongues every morning. It's a way of approaching the day. She said, I just need to give voice to that.
And Gary, I got to say, what you were describing there, how you take these people through that experience in this workshop, not a church setting, I can see how that fits into a Pentecostal service. That's exactly what I saw many, 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 many times in Pentecostal charismatic services.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those charismatic churches are about vocalizing the empathetic
and the emotions,
so there's this empathetic connection to each other that doesn't happen to other churches. It's a very touchy-feely church. You get hugged if you don't get hugged in a Pentecostal church, it's not a Pentecostal church. You know,
well, no, it's okay. But I will say that the Pentecostal churches are more charismatic. They tend to attract a lot of, for example, people who struggle with addiction. You know, and I think in a lot of ways. They really mimic, you know, things like AA and stuff like that, where connection to a group and, like you're saying, empathy, acceptance, feeling like you're just accepted, you know, with all your mess and all your, you know, they're very powerful things. And I think overall, in the history of Christianity, that's one of the strongest appeals, you know, that it provides at its best, it provides that kind of a community. So, it's not surprising to hear you say that. It's fascinating to me that you have taken, in a sense, something from your religious background, and in a sense, you secularized it, right? And found it to be quite useful.
Okay, guys, we are running out of time. There is so much more that I want to talk about. I've got more questions for you, Gary, but we don't have the time at this point. Maybe we'll do a second follow-up episode. But before we do end, I thought I'd give you the last chance. Were there any things that we didn't cover that you think really need to be put on the table? Anything?
The table would be another banquet table, so we'll leave that for another time.
So, Gary, are you purely in the theatrical side of things, or do you do film as well?
I do some film stuff, and I do art installation, like video projection stuff.
Oh, do you? Neat.
Yeah, I'm in that kind of multiple worlds.
Yeah. Okay.
I just did there was an arts award recently, and I went and they put me as collaborator because I work with musicians. I did a bunch of stuff with some blind students. Yeah, I did a whole very large installation with some blind students based on a misunderstanding. All great art comes from misunderstanding.
Happy accident, as Bob Ross used to say.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. And then as far as the listeners, they may want to find out more about you. Do you have a website? Any shows coming up?
Yeah. Shows. Nothing, no shows coming up right now. I had a bunch of them just pass, but my name is Gary Kirkham. If you Google my name, I am findable.
And we're going to have a link in our show notes for people to find you, probably through Facebook, I'm guessing.
I have a website, so I'll send you a link to my
very
website.
Good. And, Gary, I really appreciate you coming on. It was great to have encountered you at your show, and that started the discussion, and this is the product of that. I was so glad you could come on.
Look, this is fabulous to finally connect with you. Talking about speaking in tongues for like an hour. I didn't think I'd ever be able to do that. Ever. I wonder if my family members will ever listen to this going, oh, you can't be talking about this.
Well, thanks, Gary. We will talk again. Thank you very much. Okay.
Fabulous. Yeah. Thank you, Gary. Take care.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.